As part of our continuing Yahoo Finance Back to School series, we're thrilled to have spoken with the Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, earlier. The Secretary says everybody wins with the Biden administration's new student loan relief plan. Well, one superintendent in the Secretary's home state of Connecticut told me he voted for President Biden, but he's disappointed with this policy because he worked 2 jobs, saving every penny to pay back his loans. I asked the Secretary how he and millions of others like him do win with this student loan relief plan.
It's disappointing if a superintendent is not seeing that, helping people who are struggling right now, that are getting out of a pandemic, people who make under $75,000 who are going to benefit, get their feet back under them so they can buy homes and continue with their lives. That's a benefit to the whole economy. We anticipated that there was going to be a spike in defaults when loan payments started. So we're thrilled that we're preventing that for millions of Americans, and that's helping the local economy too. And, the goal of this is to really address the impact of the pandemic. We don't want folks to come out worse off now than they were before the pandemic. That's why we made this targeted relief of up to $20,000 in loan relief for folks who are eligible for Pell. It's a game changer, but we're also fixing the income-driven repayment program, which is going to help borrowers for generations.
You and the president spoke about the underlying problem here, which is the rising cost of college far outpacing inflation. What are you doing to address that?
Yeah, and I appreciate that being brought up because, look, loan relief by itself is not going to help in the long run, right? We want to make sure we're providing loan relief, but we're not in the same position 5 years from now. We're fixing public service loan forgiveness, we're fixing income-driven repayment, but we're also increasing accountability on colleges to provide a good return on investment. The costs have gone out of control, and for so many talented Americans, they're thinking college is out of reach. And honestly, there's so many more options. We're going to improve career pathways. So colleges need to be on board providing a better return on investment to students. So we're increasing our college accountability. We have the college scorecard that we've enhanced to make sure parents could see whether or not when they're looking at a school that they're not just looking at the shiny flyers, they're looking at the graduation rate. They're looking at the typical jobs that students get when they graduate from those colleges. We want to inform parents with knowledge, students with knowledge, to make sure those institutions that are of value for education are the ones that we're looking at.
You spoke about how this plan improves the economy. Not everyone in your own party agrees with that. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, as well as Obama top economic advisor Jason Furman, said this dramatically worsens the inflation problem. How worried are you that it could also worsen the economy?
I don't agree with them. Look, this president, first of all, with the Inflation Reduction Act, is anticipated that $300 billion will be reduced from the deficit, okay? So now we have targeted loan relief to people that are more likely to default if they didn't have this, which worsens the economy. Now, we have to keep in mind, folks that are making over $125,000 are not going to see loan relief. So they're going to start making payments very soon on their loans, which will reduce the risk of inflation. So it really does offset. And, it's not just, don't take our word for it. Folks like Moody's have also said the same thing. So we do believe that this is the right thing to do for Americans that are struggling, who need a little bit support so they can get back on their feet post-pandemic.
Of course, the biggest problem facing our schools right now for millions of parents like yourself is the teacher shortage. Not entirely clear how many we're short, but Nevada says there's several thousand short. Florida says there's several thousand short. This is a problem that was exacerbated by the pandemic, but certainly predates it. To you, a former teacher, what's the root of the problem?
I was a former teacher, but also school principal, is trying to fill in those classrooms when I was short teachers in bilingual education, special education. I'll tell you, the teacher shortage issue is a symptom of the teacher respect issue in this country. All right. Thankfully, right now, we have the American Rescue Plan, right? And we're telling districts and states to use those dollars to incentivize teachers in their districts, to provide bonuses to keep teachers on, or signing bonuses, to bring retired teachers who have years of experience back into the classroom without impacting their benefits, their retirement benefits. You can do that. You can do that now for short-term fix, but in the long term, we have to create grow your own programs. We have to make sure we're tapping on our on our students and our para-educators so they see themselves as teachers of tomorrow use the American Rescue Plan dollars to create pipeline programs. That's what it's there for. We're encouraging that. But let's lift up the respect in this profession. That's teachers need a competitive salary. They need better working conditions, and they need their voice to be heard when they're talking about reimagining schools post-pandemic.
Mr. Secretary, you know, studies have also shown students are up to a year behind because of the COVID pandemic. And now you have school districts in Texas limiting weeks to 4 days. Sounds obvious, but what's the impact on students?
Significant. And again, that's an example of, in my opinion, just lack of valuing education. We should be doubling, not making less. Texas probably got the most. Maybe Texas or California got the most money from the federal government in the American Rescue Plan to get hire teachers, to hire tutors, mentors. Kids need more, not less. And I think until we respect our educators, respect the education and what it means for our country, we're going to have these problems. So, going down to 4 days to me is further disservice to students that have already been impacted significantly by the pandemic.
So the other tactic is lowering the requirements. We're seeing that in Arizona where they're allowing college students to teach. We're seeing in Florida where they're encouraging veterans to do so. And the governor has said that standards are too rigid. Do you agree?
Another example, our kids need more, not less. And if your idea is lowering standards to become a teacher, then you're part of the problem.
Nice to have the Education Secretary on Yahoo Finance again as part of our Back to School series. That last point about lowering standards, Shauna, to go into the teaching profession, I'm not sure it's not being hijacked by some. Look, there might be tremendous teachers available without a teaching degree. Maybe the way we evaluate someone's readiness to join that teaching profession, as I've spoken to principals around the country, they'll tell you quietly that some of the most experienced teachers are not necessarily the best. They're just tenured and protected. Young, eager college students might be an answer, at least in the state of Texas, because 4-day weeks are devastating on our children who are already behind.
Exactly. It comes at a time when we are coming out of the pandemic. So many students haven't been attending school on a regular basis over the last 2 years, so clearly far behind. But what he was saying about incentivizing teachers to get back into the classroom, it's time that there is a little bit more action on this. Yes, we're seeing teachers take action. We had the biggest strike, or the strike of the biggest school district in Ohio, in Columbus. They were making demands, and the demands that they wanted were a lot of the issues that we just heard from the secretary. They wanted higher pay. They wanted improvements in terms of working conditions. Their concerns was about adequate heating and air conditioning in the classroom. Class sizes are simply too big because there aren't enough teachers in that school district. So certainly this sheds a light on a problem that has been in the works for years, something that we have been tracking, and the pandemic clearly, Rochelle, making this crisis severely worse.
I mean, obviously, even before the pandemic, as Dave was saying there, you have teachers who are sort of coming out of pocket, paying for their own things, already having a struggle. A lot of teachers were very put off. They were being very undervalued, especially when you look at some of the other careers that obviously earn a higher salary. I think the respect issue that the secretary mentioned is important because you want to be respected in your profession, and there are these incentives for a lot of new teachers coming in, but then for existing teachers, they're probably thinking, well, what about us? A lot of these things that we're going on strike for, we're not getting them, but some of these newer teachers coming in are getting those incentives. Hopefully we see some balance, because obviously, I mean, teachers are the lifeblood. I mean, what are we going to do if our children aren't being taught? So hopefully we get to see more action on that soon.
We should mention a very intriguing piece in the Atlantic right now. I recommend you read it. That says there is not, in fact, a national teacher shortage. They point out these shortages have existed for years, well before the pandemic, and there's no national database tracking the amount of teachers we have, which might be the first problem the Education Secretary needs to fix. I can't help but wonder if $500 billion to erase student loan debt wouldn't be better spent on improving our high schools, our grade schools, and hiring teachers.
Yeah, you raise a good point.
President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act last week as he continues his efforts to meaningfully lower healthcare costs for people across the country. For more on the impact of this bill that it has on Medicaid, we welcome in U.S. Department of Health and Human Services CMS Administrator Chiquita Brooks-LaSure. Administrator, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to get right to it. Obviously, you have a huge task ahead of you, and the clock is now ticking. I understand you're going to need to bring in some outside experts on this, but I want to know, what kind of skills are you going to be looking for? And, where do you imagine that you're going to be hiring some of these people from? I know the private sector is obviously going to be interested in getting it on the ground.
Absolutely. We are so excited to have this new opportunity. The Biden-Harris administration has really made affordable health care a huge priority, and this legislation is a huge step forward. Some of our team is already expert in a number of these provisions, but we really want to look to the outside as well. It's been a priority of ours to make sure that we engage with stakeholders as we develop new policy. We'll also be looking from experts from some of our sister agencies, so like Veterans Affairs, who already does negotiate with drug companies, which is a particular part of the new authority that we've been given under this legislation.
Absolutely. I'm sure you've heard some of the same comments that I have in terms of what the drug companies will do in response to this. In part, the analogy, I'm sure you've heard this over the years, the balloon analogy, where we might start to see increase in prices in some areas as a result of this. I've already taken a look, and I read through a lot of the language there, as I'm sure you have. It's a lot of caveats. So I wonder, how are you anticipating these moves and making sure that these drug companies don't really play games?
So I think a couple of really important pieces. One, the legislation really makes clear that beneficiaries, so people who are enrolled in Medicare, those who are over 65, those who have disabilities, really see the benefit of this legislation very soon. So right away next year, people who depend on insulin will see lower costs. $35 when you go to the pharmacist to get your insulin, a cap on out-of-pocket costs over time. These provisions take place regardless of some of the other important provisions that are in that legislation. So I just want to make clear, and I see you have on your screen just so many of the provisions that are going to make such a difference for people who depend on Medicare for their drug costs. Something I hear about all the time. Then another provision that's really around what you were saying is, how do we make sure that drug companies don't play games with us? And we of course want to work with the industry, but one of the provisions that takes place immediately is that drug companies will be penalized if they increase their costs of drugs faster than inflation. And that's something that will really, I think, help to make sure that drug companies aren't ramping up their costs, and that benefit will come to people. So if they do increase their costs more rapidly, then that will lower costs to the people who go and get their drugs from their physician.
Absolutely. I was thinking more along the lines of lowering their costs to avoid being on that top pricing. But that's your job to keep a watch. But I'm glad you brought up the insulin, because that $35 is an interesting number to me. I know already these companies do offer that as part of assistance programs, largely for human insulin. So is there further breakdown, and are you going to be looking into the various types of insulin products and how, whether or not these programs, these assistance programs, may or may not go away? Because that's also part of the drug pricing, is that these, it looks at the price before the discounts take effect. And that is something that people often say no one pays the list price. So looking at all of it from the list pricing perspective, do you think that that's going to impact some of the headway that's already been made in the industry?
So I think, as you really are identifying, drug costs and how we actually pay for them are really complicated. And so sometimes manufacturers, drug companies are passing on discounts. Sometimes people benefit them, sometimes they don't. The legislation makes clear that people are going to benefit from those discounts. And that's why I would say the $35 cap is so important. So it's not something that's kept by the insurance company. It's not a discount that is kept by the PBMs. it's something that that beneficiaries will immediately begin to play. But all of the things you're describing, really thinking about how do we make sure that drug costs are lowered for people and also for the government so that we as taxpayers are not overpaying. That is going to be a process that we will engage with a variety of stakeholders to make sure that we move in a better direction. Because I think we all know that the way drug costs are being paid in our country is not sustainable, both for people and for the federal government. And it's not one entity's fault or problem. It's something that we need to look holistically about how we approach it. And that's the tactic that we're going to take here at CMS.
Well, I do not envy you. That is a big role ahead and a lot to work with. Chiquita Brooks-LaShore, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, CMS Administrator, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
The Inflation Reduction Act is officially on the books after President Biden signed it into law earlier this week. It's wide-ranging legislation, and some of the provisions could have a big impact on retirees. Yahoo Finance's Carrie Hannon has the details for us. And Carrie, this being the biggest change in almost 2 decades to Medicare, what's the showstopper provision here to you?
I mean, this is really welcome news. And the big piece of this is the idea that starting in 2025, so we have a little bit of a wait, but they're going to cap the out-of-pocket Part D expenses, those are for their pharmaceutical drugs and so forth, at $2,000. And this is really a huge impact of out-of-pocket expenses that people spend, and it can impact, I would say, from the experts I talked to, close to 50 million Medicare recipients could benefit from this. And this is something that lasting effect moving. I mean, some of the other pieces are significant. The provisions are really, truly significant. Medicare, for the first time, will be able to negotiate directly with the drug makers for costs to try to get control of some of these really expensive drugs, particularly cancer drugs, which we know have really just escalated and so forth. So that's going to be important in terms of price controls. But they're just starting with the top 10 initially, but they'll roll out to others. But this is a big move. In addition to this, they're going to put a cap on insulin. So for out-of-pocket costs, monthly costs will be capped at exactly $35 a month will be the cap. And right now it's around 52 average, but some people spend up to 116 a month on insulin. And we know that with diabetes in this country on the rise, this is a very important piece of this legislation. And so, this is really for the first time that a majority of Medicare beneficiaries are truly going to feel the impact of having better control over their costs.
Yeah, I know the Republican Party blocked much wider insulin controls that the Democrats did prefer. Certainly good news for retirees on Medicare. Is there a greater reality check here, though, Carrie?
Yeah, good question. I mean, that's the point. There's a couple of caveats. Yes, these things aren't going to take, the provisions won't come into effect for a couple of more years. So we've got several years before this is really going to get moving forward. So patience. The second piece of it is, as we know, when things get cut in one area, they may very well get ramped up in others, whether it's in costs of other drugs that not the ones that are being negotiated, or even a lift in premiums. So you need to be aware that, costs often get shifted around. So, but I don't want to put any water on this, because we should celebrate this sort of historic moment where for the first time Medicare beneficiaries really will be able to take better control and have access to their pharmaceuticals and other things. There's also vaccines is another part of this, free vaccines. Often people needed to pay copays on many of their vaccines. So this will also be very helpful.
Okay, I want to switch gears here just a little bit, because if you're planning to save for retirement, I want to point out an eye-popping number that caught our attention today. Brookings study finding that a married couple, middle income couple with 2 children, will spend more than $300,000 to raise their child born in 2015 through the age of 17. This is when you talk about the fact that you really need to pay attention to your finances. What's your reaction to that number? Because some are saying it's actually a low estimate compared to what you might potentially be spending on your child until they're 18.
Without question, because there's so many variables. Yes, in fact, Brookings ran these numbers based on some 2017 studies that were done at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They do this sort of update all the time of the different things in this bucket. So we're talking about a shelter or housing. We're talking about education and food and health care, and then even child care when they're young, and then all the other fun things that kids like to do, like soccer practice or, extracurricular things. So, you lump all these things together and it's quite significant. I mean, really, truly, I think it's sort of $18,000 a year or something along those lines. So let's, people, we're not trying to scare people, but these Brookings numbers are eye-opening for sure. And the other thing to remember, though, this is important, they're variable by where you live in the country. The most expensive child raising costs, when they broke it all down, were the Northeast urban areas in the Northeast. The least expensive areas to raise your kid, I don't think this is surprising to me, but the rural southern states. So, it's if you live in an urban area, you're going to, it's going to be on the higher end, and in a rural area in the southern part of the country, it'll be a bit less.
Man, it is a tough number to swallow. Carrie Hannon, great to see you. Have a wonderful weekend.
Moments ago, President Biden signing the Inflation Reduction Act into law. It provides an additional $80 billion in funding to the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. Do taxpayers need to start worrying about the tax man? Yahoo Finance senior columnist Rick Newman joins us now. Rick, what do you think? For the average viewer out there, what does this mean for them?
Do you cheat on your taxes? If you cheat on your taxes, they may not be coming after you for a couple of years, but the whole purpose of adding this new $80 billion in funding over a decade is to ramp up enforcement at the IRS, which has really been hollowed out. Their budget is 20% lower than it was in 2010. Audit rates are way down. They're especially down for the wealthiest people who file and for big corporations. And when we talk about the tax gap, that's the amount of money that people in businesses owe to the government, but the government does not collect for a variety of reasons. It's mostly among businesses and the wealthy, and that tax gap is somewhere between $250 billion and $1 trillion per year. That's per year that people owe the government that they end up not paying because the IRS either can't find it or doesn't have the resources to go after it. So if you're one of those people who's hiding a few million bucks in a shell company or an offshore account, yeah, I guess you should be a little bit worried. All the rest of us, I don't think so.
Well, that's not what Kevin McCarthy wants you to think, because he tweeted this. Democrats in Washington plan to hire an army of 87,000 IRS agents so they can audit more Americans like you, Rick. What do you make of that suggestion?
I'm not slightly worried about this. And there are these claims out there. They're making all the conservative websites, and people are hearing about this. So, look, the IRS, if it wanted to, it could be really stupid and use new resources to go after waiters who make a lot of their income in cash, or people who make mistakes when they claim the earned tax credit. If they want everybody to hate them even more than they already do, sure, the IRS could do that. Number one, that's not where the money is. They're not going to get any meaningful increase in new tax revenue by going after middle and lower income people. And Janet Yellen has said that is not what we're doing. These new resources are supposed to go after the high-end people who are evading taxes. And just to break down that 87,000, I've had people asking me, is it true the IRS is hiring 87,000 new auditors? That sounds like a lot. Okay, this is over a decade. The IRS says it will probably hire about 87,000 people, but it's going to have 50,000 people retiring. So 50,000 of those new jobs will be just to replace people who are retiring to keep staffing where it is, so that you get into a much smaller number of actual new hires or new personnel. And they're not all going to be auditors. I mean, the IRS is a large agency. A lot of them will be technology people. The IRS has computers from the 1960s. They have equipment that is made by companies that are out of business. So there's nobody to service this stuff. They have computers running on Windows XP. No one has that in their house anymore. So they desperately need some new technology, some people to build that technology. And it's going to take a long time. I mean, we're talking about an investment over a decade. And we're probably not going to see a real increase in tax revenue or an improvement in enforcement until the latter part of that time period. So not much is going to change for the next couple of years.
But Rick, it is a huge win for the Democrats. We know that this has been a priority. Also, more broadly speaking, the Inflation Reduction Act that the president just signed into law is huge because it's something that he campaigned on. Is this something that you think voters are going to care so much about? How does it really move the needle at all?
If inflation were 2 or 3% right now, I think voters would be looking at this and saying, hey, the guy's getting stuff done. But I think what voters are still primarily focused on is food prices that are up 13% year over year. We've seen gasoline prices come back below $4, but they're still $3.95. I mean, that's up like almost $1 from where they were a year ago. So the thing Biden needs the most to get credit for these legislative wins he's getting, and he's racking some up, as you and I were discussing
remarkable,
right before
really.
the segment. Yeah, I mean, he's really his record suddenly is pretty good with the CHIPS Plus Act, the Infrastructure Act from last year,
and guns legislation, which has never been done. I mean, it's minor, but the W's are adding up.
Yeah, so it is still inflation, the thing that they said in Bill Clinton's campaign in the early 90s. It's the economy's stupid, still true.
None of this you feel. And this
That's right.
IRA, you won't feel either. And ultimately, that's why he's still in the 40s. Right. Rick, good to see you. Thank you.
Guys.
Breaking news, you are now looking at a live picture of the signing ceremony of the Inflation Reduction Act at the White House. Now, President Joe Biden set to sign the bill momentarily. The $750 billion bill is designed to address some of America's most significant issues like rising health care costs and climate change. Now, among the provisions in the bill, Medicare will now be able to negotiate prices for certain drugs. Let's bring in Rachel Kors, Stat Washington correspondent, to discuss. And Rachel, I know you're a longtime reporter of Washington's drug pricing reform efforts. So we've seen both sides of this. Some people are hailing this as a huge victory. Some politicians are saying it simply does not go far enough. Then, of course, there's the other argument that it could raise drug prices for the rest of us. What's your assessment of the bill and its impact?
Well, it certainly is a big step for kind of Washington's drug pricing scene. We haven't seen any policy that would put any sort of price controls on drug makers for decades. And so this certainly is a big development for Washington. But I think there are questions, like you said, about how many, average Americans will see their drug prices go down, because the changes do mostly apply to the Medicare program. So it'll save the federal government money, it'll save taxpayers money, but at the pharmacy counter, it's unclear kind of who's going to see savings right now.
Rich, it almost feels like the gun legislation, right? There's not what anyone wanted, but certainly finally a long overdue step in the right direction. So let's start with the seniors. How much theoretically will they save, and when will it kick in?
Right. So for seniors at the pharmacy counter, the most important provision for them is going to kick in 2025. And it means that when seniors go to the pharmacy, they're not going to be paying any more than $2,000 a year out of pocket for their drug costs. And that's a big deal because there's no cap right now. If they're taking expensive drugs, if they have a disease like cancer, that they can just, keep paying and paying and paying. So I think that's going to be a very big deal for them. And in 2026, if patients are taking these drugs that Medicare is going to negotiate, then they're actually going to end up paying lower prices because what they pay is a percentage of the drug's price. So there could be a potential for significant savings.
Rachel, what do we know about the possible drug candidates? I guess, do we know exactly which medications are going to qualify?
We don't quite know that yet. And I think we'll have a better idea next fall when the health department announces which 10 drugs it's considering for its first round of negotiations. But Wall Street analysts are picking out some drugs from AstraZeneca, GSK, Eli Lilly, and Novo Nordisk as potential early candidates, because drugs have to have been on the market for 9 years for small molecule drugs and 13 years for biologic drugs to even be eligible for the negotiation process. And they have to be really expensive and cost the federal government a lot of money. So it's a limited number of drugs that are going to be eligible, especially this first round. But those are kind of the companies that analysts are looking at right now.
And amazingly, no one, neither side of the political aisle, is against lowering prices for seniors. But the theory that Republicans are floating is that this will actually encourage drug makers to raise the prices on the rest of us. Is there anything in this legislation that protects the majority of Americans from seeing increasing prices?
There's not. I think the Senate Democrats really wanted to include some policy that would have ensured some protections for the private market, but those got struck out because they didn't comply with Senate rules, because they're using this really arcane budget process to push this legislation through. So I think there's definitely some questions about whether cost shifting will happen. Some experts think it will, but other experts think it won't, because the idea that drug makers are leaving money on the table right now, like they could be charging more, is just an open question as to what the market dynamics might be. So it's certainly possible we could see some cost shifting, and it will definitely be something to watch in the future.
Rachel, like Dave said, this is an issue, lowering drug prices, that has gained support on both sides of the aisle. Now that we do have this law and this roadmap, I guess, what do you think this tells us about what the future of drug pricing could potentially look like?
Well, I think there are certainly some Democrats who would like to see this as just kind of a first step, and they'd like to expand the program further. A lot of Republicans wouldn't necessarily like that to happen. So a lot depends on what control of Congress is going to look like after the midterm elections. But there are also several issues that this legislation doesn't address, like patent reform and pharmacy benefit managers, which are kind of the middlemen between drug makers and insurers. So there are certainly areas for bipartisan reform, and drug pricing advocates are planning to keep pushing even after this legislation is signed.
And lastly, what can you tell us about the overall increase in terms of, we've seen a study, how much drugs are costing, rising at dramatic rates even from a year ago?
Right. So I think one important thing to keep in mind is that this legislation doesn't do anything to regulate the launch prices of drugs. So it's very possible that we will see very expensive drugs come on the market, and this legislation won't kick in for 9 to 13 years. So it's very possible that we'll see some very expensive drugs in the market. Drug spending can certainly go up. This is not the end-all be-all, but I think there is at least some mechanism at some point for some cost controls on these very expensive medications.
Yeah, the median annual price for new U.S. drugs this year, more than $250,000. So it's a small step in the right direction. Rachel, thanks so much. Appreciate you being here.
President Biden expected to sign the Inflation Reduction Act into law this afternoon. The sweeping $750 billion legislation includes provisions aimed at drug pricing, domestic energy production, manufacturing, carbon emissions. White House National Economic Council Director Brian Deese here with more. Brian, great to have you on the program this morning. Talk to us about whether or not we should expect any sort of immediate reduction in inflation, because that's what Americans are really concerned about right now at the present.
Well, this is a significant piece of legislation that will have both immediate impact and longer-term economic impact as well. In the immediate term, tens of millions of Americans are going to see lower health care costs and prescription drug prices as a result of this bill. And immediately, Americans will be eligible for new tax credits and rebates to invest in energy efficiency in their homes and in other parts of their lives. But also across time, this bill will reform the prescription drug system in a way that we haven't in decades, to try to generate lower costs for consumers and for the federal government, and also tackle the climate crisis and increase energy security here domestically in ways that the United States, our country, has never invested in before. So you will see both immediate impact, short-term impact, and also long-term economic impact, and that's what we need right now.
Brian, this comes at a time when, of course, Americans are very concerned about inflation. This is a package that's dubbed the Inflation Reduction Act. In the context of where inflation is today, how much reduction should Americans expect on that number?
Well, look, I think that the goal of this bill is to do what fiscal policy can do at our current economic moment. And if you ask that question, the Fed is operating monetary policy independently. What can Congress and a president do at this moment? The most consequential and significant step that they can take is passing this Inflation Reduction Act and the president signing it into law today. And the reason for that is, in addition to the benefits that I just described, this bill will reduce the federal deficit. It does so by not only allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices, but enacting tax reforms, specifically establishing a 15% minimum tax for all corporations. And by doing that, fiscal policy complements what the Fed is trying to do, reducing price pressures, even as we're going at some of the most important economic challenges we face around healthcare prices and energy costs.
Brian, when we talk about just kind of the health implications of all of this, obviously a lot of focus on the drug pricing aspects, the Medicare benefits as well. You kind of unpacked this a little bit earlier, but can you just kind of outline exactly what the timing of that, how that kind of comes into effect? Because it's not something that's going to take effect necessarily this afternoon when the ink dries, right?
Well, there's a lot of families out there that when the ink dries today, they're going to have a lot more security knowing that these provisions are going to come into effect. But let me break it down for you. First, on healthcare premiums, there's 13 million Americans who, starting this fall, will benefit from lower healthcare premiums as a result of this bill. Insurers will be sending out letters in October of this year, and because of this legislation, people will see lower premiums in those letters and in their premiums that they have to pay over the subsequent year. Second, there's going to be a cap on the out-of-pocket costs that Medicare beneficiaries pay for their prescription drugs, particularly for people with chronic conditions like cancer. This cap of $2,000 will begin to be implemented at the end of this year and will make a big difference in terms of the out-of-pocket costs that people have to pay. And third, Medicare beginning to negotiate for better prescription drug prices. So what Americans can expect is to see these impacts coming into effect over time. But if you're one of the tens of million Americans who deals with high prescription drug prices or who is buying their health insurance through the Affordable Care Act exchanges, right today you can take some comfort in knowing that the president signing this into law gives you that certainty and that stability to operate your life with a little more breathing room, as the president would say.
Brian, let's talk about some of the climate provisions in this particular bill. Obviously, huge investments to tackle the climate crisis, one of them being tax credits for EV purchases. We recently had the CEO of Fiscal, obviously an EV maker, on, who said that he was worried that there were too many strings attached to getting those tax credits. In fact, he thought this would actually slow down EV adoption. So if we're talking about $7,500 credit for a new car, in your estimation, how many cars, EV cars on the market right now, would actually be covered?
Well, let me start by zooming out and then get directly to your question. The core of this bill on the clean energy side is to provide long-term technology-neutral tax credits so that we generate lower carbon energy here in the United States, and we generate the technology and the technological advances that come with that. So that means everything from wind and solar and battery storage to clean hydrogen, carbon capture, the batteries that go into electric vehicles. We want to not only produce those here, but generate the innovations here that we can then export around the world. That's where the EV tax credit comes in. Certainly it sets a high bar that tax credit is eligible for batteries and vehicles that are produced in the United States or in North America or countries that we have free trade agreements with. And we think that that's an appropriate bar because what we want across time is to provide a strong incentive for us to have secure supply chains in those areas, and for as much of that as is feasible to be happening here in America. Look, we're seeing a resurgence in consumer demand for electric vehicles, and so that's something that's happening in the market today. And we certainly expect that because of this legislation, companies and the suppliers in the supply chain are going to respond quite significantly.
Well, and we've already seen a lot of these EV makers respond in trying to source things back home, but that timeline is not just within the next year. We're talking several years. So if we're talking strictly where the market is right now, how many EVs would be covered? Are we talking 10% of the market, 20% of the market? What's your estimation?
Well, two things. One, these companies are racing towards generating more secure supply chains. It's in their economic interest as well as our national interest as well. And so I'm talking to CEOs of the auto companies as well as suppliers on a weekly basis. And what they're telling me is they want to move quickly, and they frankly want an incentive to move even more quickly toward that goal. The second, and I think this is very important, is in addition to the new vehicle tax credit, which, as you say, companies are going to have to identify if they are eligible and when they can be eligible based on the domestic content. This bill also, for the first time, has a used vehicle credit for electric vehicles. And that's incredibly important because most Americans who are out there buying vehicles are actually buying used cars, particularly lower working class folks. And so as we have more electric vehicles in our vehicle mix, having a credit for used vehicles is incredibly powerful. It helps broaden the number of Americans who could see themselves getting into an electric vehicle, maybe not a new one, but one that is used a couple of years as well.
Well, the bill signing certainly a big victory for the president. A long road for you as well, Brian. I appreciate your time today. White House National Economic Council Director Brian Deese joining us from the White House.
Shares of Plug Power are up a bit today, but they did surge quite a bit last week on the back of the company's earnings report. Despite seeing revenue miss expectations, the company got a boost from upbeat analyst calls following the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act. Joining us now to discuss is Plug Power CEO Andy Marsh. Andy, thanks for being here. So just give us in a nutshell what this new law is going to mean for you.
Well, Joy, Plug was on a great track before the new law, where we were target for our $3 billion 2025. But what it does is make the green hydrogen plants, which we're building across the United States, economically competitive with gray hydrogen across all sorts of applications, from fertilizing manufacture to green steel to green hydrogen for use in peaker plants. It actually just changes the dynamics completely with the $3 tax credit for green hydrogen. Good for Plug, good for the nation, good for the world.
Okay, Andy, so how good? When should investors start to see the impact of this flow through to your bottom line?
As we said on the earnings call, our CFO says it pushes our path to profitability up 6 months into early 2024.
What are customers asking differently from you right now? Walmart is one of your biggest partners as well. And so with regard to the relationships that you have with those customers, where they're leaning further into that relationship, what are you hearing on the demand side?
Well, I think what we're hearing on the demand side, and you could see it, another portion of our business is our electrolyzer business. We're already 50% ahead of what we expect to book for the whole year on August 1. So what we're seeing is tremendous demand for our electrolyzers, which will be used for both here in the United States and in Europe. We're seeing increased demand for our green hydrogen, for the 70 tons of green hydrogen per day that we'll be producing by the end of this year. All that's beneficial to Plug. And we're doing it, quite honestly, because customers like Walmart, Amazon, New Fortress Energy, all want us to be producing green hydrogen or building electrolyzers for them so that they could use green hydrogen.
So, Andy, for potential clients, is the biggest thing holding them back the cost? And is that one of the reasons why this bill could be particularly helpful?
I think cost, it takes it off the table. Now green hydrogen is cost competitive with gray hydrogen. Now green hydrogen can be easily added to natural gas. Yes, I think it is a big driver, which drives a lot of the industrial applications. And in the industrial applications represent 26% of the world's CO2 emissions, which is equal to mobility. It really takes it off the table. We don't have to discuss it anymore. And now we have security. This bill provides a 10-year tax credit for green hydrogen, as well as a healthy tax credit for fuel cells through 2025, which turns to tech neutral after that. So, Plug, and I think the industry, it provides insurance that it'll be around for the long run. So that's why I think folks in both, industrial applications as well as retail applications, as well as mobility applications, are all excited about this bill and really has changed the landscape for our company and others.
Andy, you mentioned you won't be profitable until 2024. So over the next 15 months or so, where are you going to be investing the most? What areas?
Oh, it certainly is in our electrolyzer and green hydrogen plants. I mean, we've announced we're going to be, investing $1 billion for our green hydrogen plants next year. We're obviously, we've had 2 new factories, one coming online as we speak in Rochester, a gigafactory for making, stacks for green hydrogen plants as well as for our electrolyzers. That's where we're putting the dollars today.
You've called data centers a $40 billion opportunity for Plug Power. Where do you start to realize some of those opportunities actually come to fruition, and how quickly does that become accretive to that path to profitability for the business as well?
Well, we've announced that we'll be deploying 60 megawatts of products for the stationary market, which is more than just data centers. Over the coming year, we expect that to be 200 megawatts over the next 18 months. It'll be used not only for backup power, but also for providing power to electric vans, which may seem odd, but it's a big market opportunity. In the long run, fuel cells in these stationary products replace peaker plants. Very much what we're doing with SK, where we'll be deploying 200 megawatts by late 2024 and 400 megawatts per year from 2025 to 2040 with our great partner SK in South Korea.
Plug Power CEO Andy Marsh, always great to chat with you. Good luck on the path ahead. We'll talk to you soon.
With inflation rising at the highest level in 4 decades, the House gave final approval last week to President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. It's meant to tame the price hikes that have hit American households this year. But will it actually do that? Our next guest says the answer is likely no. Joining us now to discuss, JP Morgan's chief U.S. economist, Mike Feroli. Mike, it's always great to see you. And of course, seems to be sort of the consensus here that the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, right, this is a bit of marketing. It's not what it's actually going to do. But are we talking about even in the longer term that it's not going to have these kinds of positive price effects on the U.S. economy?
In the longer term, it could. And again, not trying to make broad comments here about the advisability of the act itself. But I do think there are potentially some benefits to the supply side of the economy. Now, that said, in the longer term, in theory at least, inflation should be under the control of the Fed. And that is who determines at least long-run inflation. So even if it does have a long-run supply-side benefit to have inflation under control, we need to have a Fed that's focused on doing that. But I think the more visible thing is that in the short run, we don't really see much of an effect, because in the short run, the effect on both spending and taxes, or the net of those two, doesn't really do much to either add or detract from the growth outlook. Nor do we see big indirect effects through things like changes in drug pricing, in part because the way the act got scaled back by the parliamentarian at the last weekend. So, for the horizon over which these things are kind of visible, which is like maybe the next year or two, we just don't see really big effects on either growth or inflation, for that matter.
I guess, Mike, continuing down that thought process as well, how soon could consumers, even if this is signed into law by Biden this week and then spending gets fast-tracked, how soon would consumers actually notice the difference?
Definitely not this calendar year, and I'd be surprised if even next calendar year. A lot of the things aren't going to really even affect consumers all that much. So the taxes will mostly be at a corporate level, of course, and the spending will take place over quite some time. Now, some of that will come in the form of tax credits, but for most of that is directed to businesses, utilities, and others. So I wouldn't expect consumers to really notice as much. I mean, I think they're going to see what's going on in the energy markets more recently, much sooner than they're going to see anything from this.
I don't know. Maybe they'll notice when they get a tax break on the below 55,000 assembled in North America electric vehicle.
Oh, burn, Julie, burn.
That's one example. No, but I mean,
Sure.
it's very specific. Anyway, go ahead, Seth.
Michael, what just stepping back here, looking at your growth estimates, where are you at on on GDP for the third and fourth quarter? And what are your estimates, or what are they looking like for to kick off next year?
Yeah, so third quarter we're at 1, fourth quarter 1.5. Which would be better than what we saw in the first half of the year. We do think the consumer should get a little bit of relief here from energy prices. So Wednesday we'll get retail sales for July. Given what we already know about inflation for July, could be off to an okay start for real consumer spending in the third quarter. So we're feeling all right about that. That we return to positive growth territory. I mean, the Empire State Survey report this morning doesn't really point to a boomy quarter, but we do think we get back to positive growth, and I think that should continue in the fourth quarter, given the projected path for headline inflation, as well as some of the normalization in supply chains could actually be not only beneficial for inflation but also for growth, particularly if motor vehicle production comes back like the automakers are anticipating.
Mike, what happened with that Empire manufacturing number? Why was it so lousy?
Earlier I think in your segment you were talking about the strong dollar. The one sector of the economy that's going to hit the hardest is manufacturers. So that may be one factor there. Empire State had been looking a little better than some of the other regional Fed surveys, so maybe it's just catching up a little bit. I wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on, like the point estimate coming out of the Empire State, but generally speaking, I think it's reasonable to expect that manufacturing will face some headwinds here. Again, the strong dollar really means that factory sector is ground zero for the economic impact there.
One of the other kind of events that's worked its way into the conversation is the reasonable expectation, and I put a question mark around that because a lot of people are talking about whether or not the Fed should be prompted to actually have a rate cut at some point early in 2023. Is that something that should even be on the table for discussion right now? Do you believe that may happen, and what would have to even take place?
So I would be surprised if it's actually on the table at the Fed anytime soon. I think they have been pretty clear that they need compelling evidence that inflation is actually moving down and not just forecasted to move down. So we're a pretty long way from there. We had a nice suite of inflation data last week, but still I think a lot of work to be done, particularly in getting the labor market back into better balance, which hasn't really even begun. So look, as we've seen over the past couple of years, anything can happen in the space of 6 months. That being said, I think under most expectations, it's going to take quite a while before they can be comfortable getting rates back down. I think for now, the first order of business is actually to get policy rates into restrictive territory. I mean, after last month's hike, they're basically just back to neutral. So with the economy running as hot as it is, you have to get policy rates restrictive, I think, before we can even start to talk about getting them back down to neutral, which I think before we see that, we're going to need to see, inflation numbers that are even softer than what we saw last week. I mean, last week, the 0.3 we got on the core CPI was nice, but we'd probably like to see it even lower than that in a world where the Fed is going to be comfortable actually cutting rates. So,
I mean, do you think we're going to get that anytime soon? I mean, we keep, I know you're a macro guy. We try to do both as much as we can, and we keep hearing company after company telling us demand is softening in a lot of different areas, from apparel to appliances to consumer electronics. Mm-hmm. One would think that is going to have some feed through into prices.
I agree. And I think we're already starting to see evidence that prices for goods should be moving down. So we've seen weakening import prices. We've seen supply chain improvements in terms of like delivery times. So I think it's a pretty relatively safe bet to think that goods prices should be softening in coming months, and perhaps we'll see that with some of the retailers tomorrow. And we know that inventories at general merchandisers is pretty elevated. So I think that's one part, but goods are only like 1/3 of the consumption basket, roughly. So you got rents that have been running very strong, and that should persist for quite some time. And a lot of the other service prices have been kind of picking up too. So I agree that, what you're probably going to hear this week is retailers saying, consumers are under a little stress, they're a little more price sensitive. But I think we also need to see things like, again, rents is such a huge component of the price basket that we need to see that soften. And a little bit of early evidence in some of the, company reports from real estate companies that we're seeing some easing up of the imbalances in the rental market. But I think that's still early innings in terms of getting a more normal rental market.
Yeah, doesn't feel like that is in the imminent horizon. Thanks so much, Mike. Good to see you. Have a great week. JP Morgan Chief U.S. Economist Mike Feroli there.
Welcome back to Yahoo Finance Live this morning, everyone. The Inflation Reduction Act is set to be signed into law by President Biden in the coming days, opening major opportunities for investors in the clean energy space. For more insights on this, we have here with us today Jay Jacobs, BlackRock U.S. Head of Thematic and Active Equity ETFs. Jay, always a pleasure to speak with you and get some of your insights. First and foremost here, when we think about valuations and what people should realistically price in and anticipate in terms of what the Inflation Reduction Act will mean for equity companies, what should we expect?
Well, we've seen a history of investors underappreciating or underestimating the impact of these disruptive themes. So if we rewind to 2017, Bloomberg's New Energy Finance forecasted that by 2021, there'd be about 2.9 million electric vehicles sold. The actual number in 2021 was 6.6 million. So we have a history of underestimating the power of these disruptive themes. Now that we have $370 billion coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, we expect that to continue to accelerate the growth of electric vehicles and really help companies along the value chain, from car manufacturers to battery manufacturers to lithium suppliers to parts, all involved in electric vehicles, to benefit from this bill.
Hey, Jay, it's Julie here. How much will they benefit? Because there are some, particularly the electric vehicle space, there are some rules around this, right? It's not just any electric vehicle that's going to be eligible for this. They have to be assembled in North America. They have to be under, 55,000 or 80,000 if they're trucks and SUVs. So it's not as though this is like willy-nilly for any electric vehicle. So do people have to be a little bit selective in terms of what they're looking at here?
Yeah, so this policy is really designed to achieve two things. One is, how do we build out an electric vehicle industry within the United States, from the manufacturing perspective to the upstream perspective of getting lithium and battery materials ready. And then the second aspect is, how do we make electric vehicles more affordable and turn them into mass market vehicles? Right now, the average selling price of an electric vehicle is about 22% higher than your average car sale in the United States. So clearly, it's more of a luxury item today. But the idea of providing these tax incentives of up to $7,500 for EVs manufactured in the United States is to turn them into the mass market vehicle. Don't have EVs compete with sports cars. Have them compete with everyday cars that are driven for hundreds of thousands of miles at very inexpensive prices. So I think that's really the shift that we're going to see with this bill being passed.
Well, Jay, I think the Tesla can easily beat a Lamborghini. And we've seen those videos on YouTube. But look, if you want to invest in this space, is there an easier way to do it than doing your homework, per se, on individual stocks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at iShares, we're big advocates for ETF investing. We, of course, have an ETF, IDRV, investing in the entire value chain of electric and autonomous vehicles. So this is hard for investors to understand, the companies beyond the headline names. Who are the parts manufacturers? Who are the battery manufacturers? Who are technology companies innovating in autonomous vehicles? This is difficult research. And also, a lot of these companies aren't just in the United States. They can be in partner countries. They can be overseas in emerging markets, in Asia, in Europe. And being able to access all of those companies in one trade through the efficiency of an ETF, we think, is a huge benefit to investors.
Okay, so that's one of the beneficiary thematic plays that's out there. But who gets the goose egg here?
Well, I think it's really going to be felt across the entire value chain. I mean, this is the birth of a new industry. This is a revolution in transportation. It's not going to be one winner. We think that there's going to be many winners in this space, and it's going to expand beyond just passenger vehicles. We're going to get into trucks. We're going to get into alternative forms of transport. So as we see this theme continue to accelerate with this bill helping it, as well as falling prices, as well as greater consumer adoption, as well as greater infrastructure build out, we believe we're going to see a really rising tide for the entire electric vehicle industry.
And Jay, as you alluded to, I think at the beginning of the conversation, it's not just electric vehicles, of course, it's renewables more broadly. And in fact, we're going to talk to the CEO of Plug Power a little bit later in the show. So do you think that people should just kind of buy the whole green, quote unquote, or renewable industry right now?
Well, we think there's specific themes that are going to win. So, we've, of course, talked about electric vehicles, but clean energy, we think, is a beneficiary as well. We've seen a lot of interest in our iClean ETF, ICLN, which is looking at the entire global clean energy value chain as well, because a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act is also focused on providing production tax credits for companies to manufacture things like solar panels and wind turbines in the United States, as well as utilities companies to implement those technologies and produce electricity using solar and wind, as well as hydrogen and other forms of clean energy. So there are many facets to this bill, but EVs and clean energy, we think, are going to be kind of the two main winners based off of where the dollars are being allocated.
Jay Jacobs, BlackRock U.S. head of thematic and active equity ETFs. Good to see you as always. Have a great week. The House is expected to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, opening the potential to ignite some upside to clean energy suppliers. For more on what this means for the energy space is Rob Barnett, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Clean Energy Analyst. Good to see you in person. Thanks for coming down.
Thanks for having me in the studio.
Let's start from the auto perspective, because we keep looking at the Inflation Protection Bill and legislation, what it means to like a Tesla or Rivian. And I think Rivian went into great detail on their conference call last night. It may not mean much because of the caps on it. How big a problem is that?
Well, I mean, all of this stuff is very long lead time. And it's got this sort of rather almost Orwellian name, the Inflation Reduction Act. Is it going to do anything for inflation in the near term? It's really hard to say. And it is going to provide a demand boost for a lot of technologies, EVs, wind, solar, batteries, hydrogen. There's goodies in there for anybody looking at the clean energy space, but none of it's overnight. You got to think this bill is going to unfold over the course of 5 to 10 years kind of range.
Okay, and so last time we spoke, you were in the UK. You've been able to make your way over here. Thank you so much for joining us in studio. So with all of what we've seen play out in the region as well, we were talking about a heat wave back then. On the international energy front, where have things started to settle right now, and can that kind of sustain itself?
Well, so the world has actually changed a lot because of this Inflation Reduction Act. If we were talking about some of the names that we cover, sort of a First Solar, a Solar Edge, which makes inverters, SunPower, which installs solar panels, the median company in our solar theme basket was down about 8% at the mid-year. Right now, they're up about 13%. So we've seen this sea change, and it is being driven not just by the policy front, but by this tremendous sense of demand and by this energy crisis that we were talking about last time.
Yeah, Rob, I'm looking at a First Solar right now. Past month, of course, a lot of that reflects the reaction in the market after the act, up 65%. I mean, is that just too much, or are these solar companies, going to see a boom in their business?
Well, I think from a demand perspective, the fundamentals look good, but if you're looking at traditional valuation metrics, EV, EBITDA multiple, these kinds of things, they're very stretched for a lot of these companies. Now, over time, we see these sort of names growing very quickly. So can you be comfortable with a high valuation if the growth is there? That's the kind of calculus you're going through if you're looking at the solar space right now.
You mentioned a First Solar and some other solar names. You didn't mention Tesla's solar business, Solar City. Are they going to be a beneficiary of this?
Well, I think all of the solar exposed names can really benefit from that demand push. And one of the things that Tesla is doing, and all of their competitors is attaching batteries to the project when they're installing the system. So we're seeing tremendous growth on the battery plus solar business over the next 12 months.
How many years to make some of these investments real so that consumers feel them, so that businesses also feel the impacts of it as well?
Well, it's real today and it's growing fast, but it's a multi-decade process to imagine really doing the energy transition. So in the near term, these are investments that can make a lot of sense right now, particularly if you're in Europe or a place with really high commodity prices. I mean, the gas price in Europe is over $60 per MMBTU. It's 8 and change here. We're talking about an 8x difference. So there's a lot of economic incentive to get these kinds of technologies in the ground.
So as a follow-up to that, because that would make the midterm elections, that would make even 2024 extremely important for continued investments, even when we're seeing the passing of the baton from elected officials as well. And so what do you expect to hear, not just in the midterm elections, but even as we go into the next general election, on how important some of these investments are?
Well, there's one more piece of the policy equation that's not being tackled in this so-called Inflation Reduction Act, and that's the permitting side of the equation. Now, the oil and gas folks, they want to be able to get their projects done. Guess what? The wind, solar folks, they also need help getting projects across the finish line. The hardest part of getting a lot of solar, wind, or oil and gas projects through is getting them approved. So if there's any easing on permitting, reducing that NIMBY complaint, it's a good thing for all energy developers.
I just keep going back to First Solar, Rob. To your point, I mean, the PE ratio on this thing trailing is 65 times. That's almost 4 times the market multiple on the S&P 500. It's huge. But the supply chains for these solar companies, are they set up to handle this influx of what could be strong demand?
Well, we have seen a tremendous uptick in polysilicon, which is the input for the solar industry. It's what all the panels are made of. Last year, prices went up 3x. So a lot of folks are familiar with the price they're paying at the pump or gas prices even. Those are up a lot, but the input costs for the solar industry up 3x. Input costs for the wind industry, key component, steel. Steel is about 70% of the mass of a wind turbine. Steel prices are still up 2x compared with pre-pandemic levels. So they are wrestling on the profit side of the equation right now, despite that tremendous demand uptick. And so over time, one of two things will happen. Either we'll get those commodities back in check, or they'll pass those costs on to their customers.
Rob Barnett, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Clean Energy Analyst. Thanks so much for joining us here today, Rob. Appreciate it.
Well, Kevin mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act that is expected to head to the House, as he said, tomorrow. We want to dive into what it really means for the healthcare industry this time. The bill will impact things like caps on out-of-pocket prescription drugs for people insured by Medicare. Let's bring in Yahoo Finance's Anjali Kamlani, who's following that part of the story. Anjali, we've talked so much about the climate angle of this, but how significant is it going to be for drug pricing?
Well, it is and it isn't going to be significant, and I'd love to give you the breakdown. So let's start off with what it is going to cover. It does include a cap on out-of-pocket costs for Medicare, and this is really the key, is that it affects Medicare mostly. So that out-of-pocket cap, $2,000 on Medicare enrollees, down from about $6,000 is what we've seen, in recent years, and that only starts in a couple of years. We've noted that of the roughly 63 million Medicare enrollees annually, about 3.6 million have surpassed that out-of-pocket threshold at least once a year from 2010 to 2019, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation. Meanwhile, there's also drug negotiations starting from next year, but only certain drugs, and that also will not go into effect until later. We also know that vaccines are mostly covered for the elderly. Of course, we've seen that be a really important topic of conversation throughout this pandemic, noting that as you age, you definitely need that protection more. Also, the big one, insulin capping at $35. And that is a really big one because we know that has been one of the most costly drugs. We've heard about people rationing and really some concerns about how diabetics really interact with the drug system and where their drug costs are. We know that over the past few years, all the three major drug makers, which make up about 90% of the market, have reduced their costs, but only in part. Noted on your screen right now, Eli Lilly, really at the top there, allowing $35 cap for all individuals and across products, but others have had more limited focus for that $35 cap. Sanofi with that $35 for only the uninsured, and Novo Nordisk sticking to that $99 cap that all three had come down to in recent years, and only allowing a $25 cap for Walmart products. So that's really where you're seeing all the movement for this bill and the potential impact it has really focused on Medicare.
Anjali, really quickly, this has been, packaged as an inflation reduction bill. How long until Americans actually see the benefits for drug pricing that are included in this bill?
Not too far out. Like I mentioned, most of these have sort of a few years time gap before going into place, the reduction of certain medications being negotiated. So all of that really told in the next few years, you'll start to see that impact, but it really is going to be some time before we see what the future potential is. We also know that the pharma industry is looking at legal action to fire back on all of this. So really, the question is still up in the air.
Okay, Anjali Kamlani, we'll be watching that one closely. Obviously, the House set to take up the vote tomorrow.
One key part of the Inflation Reduction Act extends and expands the electric vehicle tax credit. But it's not all good news if you're in the market for an electric car. Let's talk about this with Yahoo Finance's Pras Subramanian here with a closer look. And Pras, at least for today, the EV makers moving to the upside on the news of this legislation.
Yeah, Sean, on the face of it, good news in the sense that they're going to get rid of that cap of 200,000 vehicles that was imposed on manufacturers as the cap as to when the EV tax credit would go away. Now that's gone. But they've added some new requirements that Joe Manchin wanted in that bill, namely that cars have to be within a certain price range. Sedans can't be over 55,000. SUVs have to be below 80,000. The cars all have to be made in North America. And also there's a battery sourcing requirement we're going to hear more about that. The components of the batteries that come from the U.S. or our key trade partners. So there are some issues there with boosting EV adoption, and a big trade group, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, said that 70% of all EVs on sale right now would not qualify under the new rules.
So then, Pras, as we read the fine print, then which top-selling EVs are eligible for this?
So we took a look at the top 5 selling EVs and their kind of sister brand cars in the market, and we wanted to see whether they would actually qualify. So the top selling EV in America, according to registrations, are the Model S and Tesla Model Y. The Model 3 and the Tesla Model Y. The Model 3, only the cheapest version would qualify under this rule, and the Model Y, both models would actually, the performance and the regular long range would qualify based on the pricing. Secondly, the Ford Mach-E, right, very popular model here for Ford. The Mach-E is cheap enough to qualify under as an SUV, but it actually qualifies as a North American-based model because it's built in Mexico. So that actually ensures that it actually will qualify for that. The Jeep Wrangler 4xe, same thing, made in Ohio, and also that is a plug-in hybrid, so that qualifies, and it is cheap enough to qualify as an SUV. And finally, the Hyundai Ioniq and Kia EV6, two really up-and-coming, strong EV competitors in space. They're both made in South Korea, so they will not qualify for this tax credit.
So even if people do decide to get more cars, is the infrastructure keeping pace? Are we ready to have an influx, perhaps, if more people do want to take advantage of this?
This is this whole chicken and the egg problem, right? Do we have enough EV infrastructure to have the cars? Do we have enough EV cars on the road to actually make the EV infrastructure game worthwhile for investors? So that is a big problem in this country. It's more advanced in places like Europe and in China, for instance. But with the $7.5 billion the Biden administration is pumping in for this EV infrastructure game, we'll see if they can actually get that happening by mid or end of decade, where it actually makes sense for people like me or you who own an EV in a city. Can we actually charge those cars and when we don't have a home, for instance?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act also includes some changes to our healthcare system. Yahoo Finance's Anjali Kamlani is here with what changes made it into the final bill and what didn't. Anjali, what do we need to know?
Well, Rochelle, the bottom line that you need to know is Medicare is the most affected, and this is a really big changes to the Medicare program in many years, in part because Medicare will now have the ability to negotiate drug prices, which is something that many advocates have been calling for years. In addition, we know that there's going to be a cap for out-of-pocket costs for enrollees, as well as insulin, which is a really big focus. As we know, insulin prices have come up over the years significantly. So what there is a $35 cap for Medicare enrollees alone. There was some discussion about the ability or possibility for those Medicare, for broader the population to have access to that same cap. Now, I want to get into that a little bit because there is a lot to focus on there. Oh, sorry, a last point as well. The ACA subsidies extended through 2025, and that's really important for those who rely on the subsidies in order to become covered. We know that the Biden administration has touted the number of uninsured reducing in the past few years as a result of those subsidies. Now, back to insulin, which of course we know really big topic of conversation. States, which is where some insurers are regulated, have introduced caps that range from $25 to $100 over the past few years. California pursuing manufacturing its own cheap insulin. Civica RX, that nonprofit healthcare group, also pursuing cheap production. So a lot of focus on being able to give more access to those who need it. We know that 1 in 4 patients have said that they ration insulin as a result of the high cost in the past few years, according to a Yale study recently. So a lot of attention on this one life-saving drug, and that puts a lot of pressure on Eli Lilly, Sanofi, and Novo Nordisk, who account for 90% of the market. And some of them have introduced that $35 cap, but there are nuances there, and a majority are still looking at 30-day supplies at pretty high cost for patients. Back to you.
So I liken this Inflation Reduction Act to someone who says they're going to eat healthy, then they have the calorie bomb that is a taco salad. Is there anything deflationary in the Inflation Reduction Act?
I don't think so. It really doesn't affect gasoline and food and the things that most Americans care about right now. It's worth noting, however, that the spending and the deficit reduction is over a 10-year period. That's a rounding error. I don't see this as having a huge impact, plus or minus, on the deficit, and the same with inflation.
And Greg, obviously there's a lot crammed into this bill. So who are the real big beneficiaries from this?
Well, alternative energy manufacturers for sure. I think that the financial sector got off pretty well with just a 1% excise tax on the stock buybacks and not having to get hit by the carried interest provision. I've been calling carried interest for years Rasputin, the plan that would not die. And I think that the industry did pretty well with that. A lot of provisions in there that Manchin got, and we still probably don't know all the details, but I think the energy industry did a lot better than people have thought. In fact, a lot of people in the Republican Party have been upset with the oil industry for not opposing this bill more aggressively.
Well, Greg, what do you make of the new corporate taxes here? The bill imposing 15% minimum corporate levy on companies that have traditionally been able to pay little to no taxes. What does that do for competitiveness here for the U.S., at least in the long term?
I think 1% right now is not a big deal. I mean, the market shrugged it off today and late last week. So I don't see it as a huge deal. But let me just say this. This is a foot in the door for the Democrats. What's next? Will they go for a 2% tax on stock buybacks? Will they go for maybe 15 or 20 prescription drugs instead of 10? Will they look at a corporate minimum tax of 16% or 17%? So they have their foot in the door. And I think a legitimate fear is that over the next few years, they'll try to get more.
Well, it's poised to be the Biden administration's final piece of major legislation. Based on the numbers we're seeing, Republicans take the House, divided government, nothing gets done the next couple of years. How does the corporate world view this bill? How do investors invest off of this bill, if at all?
Yeah, if at all, good point. I do think that alternative energy will get some pluses, whether it's electric vehicles or wind or solar, things like that. But in the short run, I don't see a big impact. Like I said a few minutes ago, I think that the inflation impact will be very minor. Frankly, I think the bigger inflation story comes on Wednesday and Thursday when we get new data from the government.
And so, Greg, then for the average American watching this, what should they be taking away from this? What's the most important thing they should be keeping an eye on in this legislation?
Well, I guess I would say that that's it for a while. I don't see very much. Manchin might want to do a little bit more, but I think the momentum is gone to do much more of any kind of legislating, and that will extend for the next 2.5 years. Hard to believe we still have almost 2.5 years left of the Biden first term, and I think that there's not going to be a lot done.
Craig, this does give Democrats progress on many of the key issues, especially what President Biden did run on. So we did see an advancement here. Do you think this is going to help at all, help the Dems in just a couple of months when when it is time for the midterms?
It's tempting to say yes. He killed the head of Al-Qaeda. The abortion vote in Kansas certainly helped the Democrats. You've got this bill, you've got another bill on chip manufacturing. So he has gotten a lot done. But I think for most Americans, it's not enough. What most Americans want to see is the price of gasoline well below $4 a gallon, the price of food coming down. Until we see a really dramatic improvement of inflation, I think all of these other things are secondary.
So then what does this mean in terms of investment strategy from this point, being that we don't know how soon we'll hit a recession, and now we have obviously this huge legislation about to potentially be passed by the House soon?
Yeah, I think that the deficit reduction, is a sign that the era of really huge spending is starting to come to an end. And I say that because in all likelihood, the Republicans will take the House. That's a pretty safe bet. The Senate is not. That's a close call. But if the Republicans take the House with one of the two houses flipping, I think that we're not going to see a lot of new spending. And I think in terms of interest rates, you've got both the Fed and fiscal policy quite tight. And I think that tight policy will persist. That's a good story for the bond market.
Hey, Greg, earlier here, just a minute ago, you said that we need to see substantial improvement on inflation in order to have any real help here for the Democrats in just a few months. What does significant improvement look like? Are we talking about 6%, 5%, 4%? Give us a ballpark of what you're expecting to see or what needs to be done in order to give Dems that edge.
Good question. I think starting Wednesday, I think we'll see some signs that inflation is peaking, but peaking at a very high level. I think that, a 4 or 5% inflation rate going into next year would be great, but that's not 2. And the Fed wants to see 2. And I think that after the unemployment number we got last Friday, obviously the Fed is tilting towards 75 basis points. So for all of the optimists, all of the bulls who feel the Fed is going to flip and not tighten as much, I just don't see it. I think the Fed has a lot more work.
We'll certainly be keeping an eye on it, and I know investors will too. A big thank you there, Greg Valliere, AGF Investments Chief U.S. Strategist. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, everyone. Washington, D.C. in focus today after Senate Democrats narrowly voted to pass the Inflation Reduction Act 51-50, sending the legislation to the House. Yahoo Finance contributor Kevin Cirilli joins us now with the latest. Kevin?
Well, it was a dizzying weekend for lawmakers, especially in the Senate, where Vice President Kamala Harris cast that deciding vote in order to get the Inflation Reduction Act over the finish line. Now we're expecting that the House of Representatives will vote on this legislation on Friday. $385 nearly billion by most estimates is wrapped up in this massive piece of legislation, something that Republicans are adamantly against and that Democrats say would reduce the cost of inflation. You've got you've got part of the bill that will go to climate investments. Think electric vehicles, wind, solar. And it's also going to put that corporate minimum tax rate at 15%. Now, Senator Sinema, who was one of the key drivers behind this legislation getting across the finish line in the Senate, was able to pull out $4 billion for drought relief in Western States. But what's not in this bill is the lowering of a carried interest tax break. There was a lot of last minute lobbying over the weekend by some private equity firms in order to keep that piece of policy in, and they were able to be successful on that.
And Kevin, you're also watching President Biden's approval rating.
Yes, a new ABC News poll, Ipsos poll, out today that has some bad news in terms of how most Americans are viewing President Biden. More than 2/3 of Americans think that the nation's economy is getting worse. This is the highest that measure has reached since 2008. But even go a little bit deeper into this poll, and you'll find that the president's rating on inflation is just 29% of Americans say that they feel that the president is doing a good job in combating inflation. We're going to get new inflationary data report on Wednesday. Remember, inflation at 9.1%, the highest that's been in nearly 4 decades, since 1981. So a lot of new economic inflationary data, not just here in the United States. We're also going to track in China as well as other countries that are releasing some inflationary data this week as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting that the numbers are still like that, even though gasoline prices have come down so much in terms of those approval ratings. And finally, in Wyoming, you are watching the race for the state's lone House seat because it's a big one.
Oh, it's a big one. It's Trump-backed Harriet Hageman against Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who, of course, has really become the de facto leader for Republicans who are against the former president, given her role within the January 6th committee. There was a poll that was released by the local newspaper there that has Hageman out in front by a lot, 30% for Liz Cheney, 52% for Hageman. But regardless of what happens here, well, we all remember the ads that were cut just last week. You got Don Jr. releasing ads for Hageman, and you've got the former Vice President Dick Cheney releasing an ad for his daughter. Both factions of the conservative movement will try to claim victory in terms of what this means for their future. Should Congresswoman Cheney not be able to win this primary this week, she becomes the leader of that Never Trump movement, and her political future will be carefully watched. And she becomes the leader of this movement, Julie, even outside of her state, as the most name-recognized, notable figure, given, again, her perch within the January 6th committee.
Yes, going to be very interesting to watch her next chapter. Kevin Cirilli, Yahoo Finance contributor, thank you so much. Good to see you.
Another angle, again, coming out of that bill is the ambitious climate spending. But what is the impact across the energy complex, and where do prices go from here? For more on this, let's bring in Rich Pontillo, NASDAQ senior energy analyst, joining us remote. Great to have you on the program, Rich, this morning. Look, we were just talking about oil prices earlier at the top of the show. They've been falling. Again, Brent, below $90 a barrel. What do you think the story is going forward, especially with this Inflation Reduction Act, as I was just talking about with Rick Newman? Those provisions won't be kicking in the next few months, but nonetheless, it will have a way on the overall energy industry, won't it not?
Yeah, hey, good morning. It certainly will. I think the impact on actually the price of oil is a bit more mitigated at the end of the day. That's the commodity that is most consumed globally, about 100 million barrels per day. And again, too, I think what we need to step back a little bit right now is remind ourselves that this is just a U.S. domestic bill. So there's still international policies that are not quite aligned with this type of framework. So I think that's one perspective to keep in mind. But certainly, if you look at all the renewable energy companies, the solars, the hydros, the winds, they have been rising in anticipation of this passing, and they're all still up today. But I think the expectation was that this would largely be passed. Of course, a lot of it is just an extension and some enhancements of longer-term tax credits. I think one of the primary benefits to a lot of the renewable companies right now through this piece of legislation is that it really just gives them more long-term visibility, right? So I think if you look at some past legislations, there was a worry that maybe in a couple of years or a new administration comes in, they are removed. I think now with them being extended almost into the next decade, that allows a lot of renewable companies to undertake capex projects that are more long in duration, require a lot of capital. They can do so more confidently.
So, Rich, when we talk about just kind of, the likes of ExxonMobil, right, the oil producers here in the United States, a big story has been capex. And I wonder if there's any sort of interaction with how this bill biases towards, the more climate-friendly industries and emerging industries, whether or not you think that changes the story for the oil and gas companies here in the United States in what they're choosing to spend on projects at the moment.
Again, on a scale level, not quite that much. Again, if you think about how large these companies are and where the majority of their capex goes to, it's large, long-lived projects that are more, again, focused still on hydrocarbons, but they've certainly been diversifying their portfolios over the last couple of years, or have accelerated the diversification of their portfolios the last several years, either by organic growth or also some additions, kind of what they term as bolt-ons. But at the end of the day, they're still largely focused on the hydrocarbons right now. But again, you've seen a lot more of the industry taking on the energy transitioning, recognizing that it is amongst us, but again, also emphasizing that it's not going to happen overnight. It's a multi-decade process. We're not going to wean ourselves, not only the U.S., but globally, off of hydrocarbons, at least in the next 10 to 15 years. And so much of that capex still does continue to be primarily reliant on hydrocarbons. But again, diversifying on the margin, continuing to grow that, utilizing some of the organic free cash flow that they've been able to generate over the last year or so, and putting that into new investments there as well, largely focused on carbon capture and sequestration.
Short term, what do you see as the outlook for energy stocks broadly? Because they've been the big winner throughout the market turmoil of 2022. Again, you see what oil prices are doing now. That might hurt the margins at some of these companies. I mean, do you think that it's going to be a rocky road for energy stocks for the rest of 2022, or what's your outlook?
Yeah, so I think 2022, again, right, to your point, energy was the most significant outperformer in the market for the first half of the year. It's taken a little bit of a breather in June and in July and into August. Again, I think a lot of that is kind of a mid-year rebalancing, some consolidation of positions. Certainly you've seen the price of oil come in a little bit. If you look at over the last couple of weeks, the energy companies reporting earnings, I think they were largely in line. There were some beats generally. I think the primary focus continues to be for energy companies, at least here within the U.S., is shareholder returns. So they've been increasing dividends, increasing buybacks, to your point in the last conversation. That's what the average investor wants that's invested in an energy company, because they kind of had a bad rap in the prior decade, where they were largely known for outspending cash flow, kind of chasing production growth. And now over the last couple of years, they've become much more disciplined. They're generating free cash flow. So I think from that standpoint, they've continued to do that. I think that one of the main things to focus on through the remainder of this year and into next year is really kind of cost creep. A lot of the companies that reported this past earnings season kept production relatively flat, and a lot of them are forecasting to maintenance production next year. But they did raise some capex because of those inflationary factors that are impacting, again, across the board.
All right, Rich Pontillo, NASDAQ Senior Energy Analyst, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. Inflation Reduction Act, we've already discussed. It might not reduce inflation.
No, we can just say it won't.
Okay, well, I mean, we got that out of the way. Yeah. How do you pay for it, right? Because the idea here is that 15% corporate minimum tax is also getting a lot of attention, and also that 1% excise tax on buybacks also getting an amendment over the weekend.
Right. So let's put those two together, because there have been taxes have been in, taxes have been out. So how much is this tax increase we're talking about anyway? So when you add it up, it looks like it's about $43 billion in new business taxes per year. I like to do it on a per year basis instead of for 10 years, because what does it add up to every year? For comparison, so about $43 billion in new business taxes per year. Had Congress raised the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%, which is what President Biden wanted, that would have been about $75 billion per year. So it's less than that. And if Congress had raised the corporate tax rate only to 25%, that would have been about $50 billion. So it's less than that as well. This is not that big of a tax hit for the companies that'll be paying.
Well, and I feel like this is an important conversation, because we've talked a lot about, the drug pricing, and maybe that's going to be something that consumers will face. And we've talked about the inflationary components of it. But again, with regards to the stock market, a lot of people might be wondering, okay, is this going to marginally increase the amount that companies are paying, which, as you pointed out, is a bit of a complicated picture because there's tax credits that are involved. So, like, net, do you think that this bill does a lot to move the needle on how much corporations are paying in tax right now?
Not much. And let's go, but let's talk about that global, or that it's not the global. Sorry, it's
right,
it's the minimum book
right.
tax of 15%, totally separate from what a global minimum would be, which we don't have yet.
And Yellen's still negotiating.
So another way to describe that is as a corporate alternative minimum tax. And tax experts really don't like a minimum book tax because what this does is it just negates tax benefits that are already on the books. So in the tax code, there are incentives for U.S. companies to invest here in the United States, to purchase equipment and things like that. That's the R&D tax credit, other tax credits. And Congress is not taking those away. They're just saying if you claim too much of these tax credits, we're going to say you're not going to get all that benefit. We're going to impose this other minimum. So you're sort of imposing a new tax that negates tax credits that are already there. I mean, it's sloppy. It's overcomplicated. It's not clean. There was a corporate alternative minimum tax in the 1980s for a few years. Congress abolished it because it was inefficient, it was hard to enforce, and it's not hard to imagine that would happen again, that we have this minimum book tax for a while, and it just turns out to be not that effective.
I mean, at the same time, though, do you feel like corporations are irked enough about this where they would try to, get the lobbying effort on Capitol Hill to maybe get the House, which is going to be handling this next, to stop it? I mean, you might look at the details on 1% excise tax on stock buybacks. That's a huge story for corporates through the post-pandemic period to kind of boost the stock price again. You don't really hear I'm not hearing a lot of companies coming out here and trying to follow this bill, though.
There's a reason for that, because I think they can't say this outright, but I think the business lobby is breathing a sigh of relief because this could have been a lot worse. This is it. This is pretty much the maximum increase in business taxes we're going to get under the first term, at least, of the Joe Biden administration, because it's extremely likely Republicans are going to take control of the House in the midterm elections. So Democrats probably won't be able to pass any more tax increases. So this is really not that bad. And if you don't believe me, look what the stock market's doing. I mean, where is the big dip on, oh my God, this is going to be a huge hit to corporate profits? There is none. There has been almost no reaction in the markets that you can actually attribute to concerns that this is going to affect corporate profitability. I think what most people think is going to happen with the buyback tax is companies are just going to shift the dividends. That there are two ways to give money back to shareholders, either through stock buybacks or through dividend increases, and we're just going to see dividend hikes.
Yeah, and we just showed that chart earlier from S&P showing just how much buybacks have been used. Look at that, the blue line, right, compared to the purple line of dividends. Of course, dividends a little bit more costly.
So that blue line's going to come down and the purple line's going to go up.
Well, dividends are more of a recurring revenue stream, though, so maybe fewer companies will be able to do that. But yes, that point's certainly sailing. Yahoo Finance's Rick Newman. Thanks so much.
We'll continue.
Well, we're going to stay on this topic and bring in BTIG Director of Policy Research, Isaac Boltansky, with more on the Inflation Reduction Act here. And first and foremost, want to get your reaction to this. And as we've been breaking it down, where some of the most significant movement could take place as a result of this, and perhaps where you're still raising a few question marks.
I think on balance, I agree with Rick's overview there, that this is not going to be a bill that ultimately changes the market's trajectory one way or the other. I think that we can point to some clear winners in the clean energy space in particular, but I've already been talking to some folks around those names who say, look, it's great to have these subsidies and this money flowing to the space, but there are some questions about getting that money to work, right? If we talk about electric vehicles, are we really going to be able to source all the materials that we need domestically in order to enjoy the full tax credit? For solar and wind, are we still going to fight some of those NIMBY dynamics, the not in my backyard, that make actually applying these subsidies on scale more difficult? So to me, I think the big takeaway on the clean energy side in particular is it is very positive for the space to see this energy. I think it'll be a tailwind for this space overall. But we're going to have to get into the details to see if all of these subsidies are really going to be put to good use.
Isaac, a question about that new 1% tax on stock buybacks. What is that going to change at affected companies? Are they just going to shift over and do a little less buying back of stocks and maybe increase dividends more? Is this just going to be shifting from one place to another?
I think that's exactly right. I think by and large, all we're going to see is a move from heavy buybacks to perhaps more of a split with dividends. I'll be interested to see how it impacts banks. As you know, some of the largest banks have been focused on their capital distribution limitations given the CCAR or stress test process. So I think there's some questions there about how that will unfold strategically. But by and large, as you know, the tax code just incentivizes and disincentivizes, right? And so this is just going to incentivize a shift over to dividends by and large.
Let's talk about the climate portion of the bill for a second, Isaac. Hi, it's Julie. It seems we are seeing some movement in some of these stocks and have been seeing some movement in some of these stocks. I think about Plug Power. I think about some of the electric vehicle makers that have been running up in advance of this. How much of a boon is this going to be for that industry and also for climate activists, for that matter, who have been pushing for some of these changes?
Yeah, look, my caution is based solely on, there's immense amount of excitement here in DC and from Democrats, right? Because they've been able to take their rhetoric and put it into reality. And there's $370 billion coming to clean energy. That's huge. It's massive. I think that my one cautionary point is simply that it's going to take some time to see if all of those 40 plus different tax credits that are in the legislation for clean energy are actually going to work, right? We're covering everything from automobiles to wind turbines to heat pumps. Some of those are going to fail and they'll miss the mark. I'm of the view, at least this morning, if we're talking about, price action, it should be a tide that lifts all boats. But over the next few months, we're going to have to dig through and say, perhaps some of the requirements regarding, let's say, electric vehicles and having to get the materials for the batteries onshore to get the full value of the credit might prove a little bit difficult over the next few years.
Isaac, the pharmaceutical industry, Big Pharma, rarely loses a lobbying battle in Washington, D.C., and now Medicare will be able to negotiate the price of some drugs in the program. What does that mean for pharmaceutical industry profits? I mean, this is a very profitable industry. Some of the scare language about this is, there's going to be massive loss of life because innovation for new drugs is going to stop. What is the real impact of that change going to be, do you think?
Look, as always, the truth is somewhere in between the opposing talking points, right? And I think that we can definitely make an argument that some of the concern around the drug pricing changes will impact asset allocation, R&D dollars, and perhaps impact the overall trajectory of some of these life-saving medicines. But on balance, Rick, my big takeaway is if we would have talked the morning after Georgia flipped, and I would have told you we wouldn't have a tax increase on the top rate for capital, for corporations, for individuals, and that we would only be introducing a new drug pricing regime for some drugs and only capping prices for a certain segment of the market over time, you would have thrown me off your air and said, Isaac, you're crazy. There's no way that's all that's going to get produced. But here we are the morning after, and that's all that happened.
Yeah, it does seem like it is pretty extraordinarily limited when it comes to that effect. I mean, at the same time, we talked to one of your peers at another shop who said the pharma companies are just going to make up this cost anyway by having higher prices on stuff that's not negotiated and not regulated. Do you think that's going to be the outcome?
I think that when we talk about what's going to happen downstream, there's going to be a movement away from some of the drugs that are covered in terms of pricing power, right? And so obviously, if you are capped on a certain subset of drugs and how much you can charge, you're going to move to drugs that aren't covered. And we can have this debate again whenever Democrats have a trifecta. But as Rick outlined before, the pharma industry is pretty safe now. This is the worst that they're going to see for the next few years because at a minimum, the House is going to flip. And then we can talk about where we are in 2024. But in terms of how bad it could have been for the pharma industry the morning after we saw Democrats take Georgia, this is nothing to lose any sleep about.
Yeah, I guess when we're talking inflation reduction, it's especially not true when we're talking about the pharmaceutical industry, unfortunately for many Americans out there. Isaac, thank you so much for being here. Isaac Boltansky, BTIG Director of Policy Research, and our Rick Newman as well. Thanks a lot, guys.
Big win for Democrats. After a sweeping climate and economic package passed in the Senate on Sunday, the Inflation Reduction Act now heads to the House, who will return from recess on Friday. Let's bring in our very own Yahoo Finance senior columnist, Rick Newman, for more analysis on Rick. Some clear winners and losers. What's your hot take?
It's definitely a win for Democrats. Now, this is called the Inflation Reduction Act, as we've been saying ever since the bill materialized a few weeks ago. It's not going to reduce inflation, so let's dispel any expectation that it's going to make a difference.
Not even in the longer term?
I don't think so. I mean, you can look at the macroeconomic effects over 10 years. I don't think anybody's ever going to notice if we gain, inflation is 0.2 of a percentage point better than it would otherwise be. What I think this kind of bogus name allows Democrats to do is, if inflation does decline by the end of the year, guess what they're going to say? Oh, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act and we did it. So it's kind of a credit claiming thing, anticipating that inflation will decline. But just to go back to some of the big provisions in this bill, it's about $370 billion for green energy investments. That's probably a good thing. I mean, critics say there's no larger coherent plan, but when is there a larger coherent plan? There will probably be some breaks for seniors getting prescription drugs under Medicare. There's now a $2,000 annual limit on out-of-pocket expenses. There's a cap on the amount people in Medicare will have to pay for insulin each month. So that is something that people will actually feel. And then there's about $80 billion during the next decade for better enforcement at the IRS to close the so-called tax gap, which could be between $500 billion and $1 trillion that Americans owe in taxes that they're not paying because the IRS can't go after people who are evading taxes. So there's a smattering of other things in the bill, of course. But I think the important thing for Democrats is this bill is not going to really do much harm, if at all. So there will be modest tax increases on some businesses. But, a year from now, it's not going to be like the economy is going to crater and it's going to be clear that this bill caused that. It's probably not going to do no harm, no measurable harm, and some good over a period of time.
No harm to the wealthy, right? No harm to the wealthy.
Not much. So you could say that the modest increase on business taxes could hurt shareholders a wee little bit. I mean, the market has not really indicated any concern about that. So no tax hikes, no increases in the corporate tax rate, and definitely no increases in individual income taxes.
Does any of this change the midterm calculus?
Marginally, this is good for the Democrats, and it could help in the Senate. So think about Mark Kelly is a senator running for re-election in Arizona. So Mark Kelly is able to say, I got $4 billion, along with Kirsten Sinema, who's also from Arizona. She's not running for re-election. Mark Kelly is. He's able to say, look, I got $4 billion in drought relief funding for Arizona. Also the CHIPS Act, which Congress passed just a couple weeks back, that will benefit businesses in Arizona. So for a couple Democratic senators on the margins, yes, it could help Democrats keep control of the Senate. I don't think it's going to help them keep control of the House because the odds and the numbers are just really heavily tilted against them.
Yahoo Finance's own Rick Newman, thanks for helping us break this down.